Chris, this is a very interesting report about, Electrostate versus Petrostate in Canada. Which path do we take? What are some of the, top three takeaways from your point of view?
Top three takeaways is we need to have, well, first thing would be a lot more national conversation about what we're trying to achieve, right? Because instead we have a lot of bickering and divergent viewpoints of where the nation, like we're at a point of crisis. We know that points of crisis are both a danger and an opportunity, right? But we really need to think, okay, what do we see as being the long run of evolution of Canada, 10 years, 2050, out past 2100? Because you really do need something like that in mind, even if you're going to be updating it and changing it through time. That's number one. Two, we have to understand where the global we are going to arrive at a global electrostate. Like that's it, whether or not it's 2060 or 26, 2100 to 2100, that's where it's evolving. Electricity is just a more efficient way to do things. It's where the technology is evolving. We're passing through fossil fuels on the way to that, and they will be used. They're going to be critical in the petrochemical sector, all sorts of things. But we have to understand we can't get stuck here in using fossil fuels forever. It's just not, the planet will keep warming and eventually will destroy the agricultural sector. And enough said. Those would be I guess the two things that I would say are the key things to take away from this.
Yeah, I want to talk about that lack of a conversation or lack of understanding what's going on at the global level, because it seems like Canada's almost, well, let me put it this way. In 2015, with the election of the Trudeau government, I would argue that climate policy got serious in Canada. Over the course of 10 years, while Justin Trudeau was prime minister, whether you agree with it or not, there's no way to disagree that there was a serious attempt by the federal government to address emissions and implement clean energy strategies as a way to bring down greenhouse gas emissions. That was Now, the problem, of course, is that now we view everything through a climate lens. So when public support or when international conversation about emissions and climate change wane as they are now, we're right back on the old oil and gas path that we were, 10, 15 years ago. And how do we change that? How do we change the conversation to what you just mentioned?
Yeah, no, anchoring everything in climate doesn't work. Climate is one component of ongoing development, right? And it should be there along with productivity and how we're going to share our wealth and what have you, right? So how are we going to make our wealth? How are we going to share it? How are we going to situate ourselves sustainably so that this country's functioning a century from now, and we're much wealthier and better off and can help both our own citizens and everybody else. Yeah, and you have to center climate within that. So that's where the long-term signals on climate really, really matter. And I think where we went off the rails is with the oil and gas sector, very specifically in coal, right? We took a shot at trying to say to the oil and gas sector, yes, you can keep producing and you do need to keep producing because this is where we are today, but you need a vision for where you're going to go in terms of emissions and production through into the future. And instead, we let two visions form there. One where we can just keep on using fossil fuels practically forever, and one where we don't. And where that diverged, the national conversation kind of fell apart on climate and how we're evolving as a society would be my take.
I really like the way you framed it, where all the trends in the technology and in policy and in adoption and deployment of these technologies at the global level is the arc is bending to the electrostate. And the only
Mm-hmm.
question now is timing. And we see then that and I loved the way you phrased it, we're moving through fossil fuels, through oil and gas on our way to the electrostate. And of course, Canada is very lucky because we have oil and gas reserves, such as bitumen in the Alberta oil sands, that could be the basis for materials, non-combustion uses.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And the problem is not, do we have the resources? Do we have the technology? Do we all of that? We don't have the vision. We're not conceiving of the issue correctly, and therefore we get sidetracked into these silly debates that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, exactly. A given developed country always has to have a bit of an R&D element that the government has to help for because it's just too far out in the future to pay out immediately, right? So government's always helping invest in the future labor force and ideas and new ideas that then start to spill out into and you get startups and the private sector starts to pick this up and eventually turn it into things. But knowing what to invest in, where to send development, like R&D is not completely random. You need to know where to send people, where to direct people, right? So in terms of power, batteries, power electronics, industrial decarb, new chemistries for cement and the chemical sector, what have you. Like you send those kind of directions, and those are the kind of startups you get that then the private sector can take off with. Now, ideally, we do more of that in Canada. We have a habit of sending them to the US, and that's part of another conversation we could have of the whole innovation ladder. But it's that directionality that government is for. It's part of their job to give society. It's to work with society and partly work with it so that it kind of comes up from the bottom. You have a vision of an adjustable vision of where you're going.
I think it's fair to say that in the United States during its heyday, it did that very well. And a lot of the kind of public support, the Americans are fond of saying, "Oh no, we're free enterprise. We don't believe in government invest." They had more government support for R&D and innovation than anybody else, and they did it through the military and they did it through universities. They didn't do it directly, perhaps, but they certainly did it. And then now they're getting away from it, and that's causing them some problems because China has arisen with this, innovation ecosystem tied to advanced technologies. So there's some conflict there. But Canada is not having those conversations, and we seem to be getting passed over because we don't understand that the game is changed. We're still playing checkers when other countries are playing 4D chess.
That's the problem. We're a highly developed nation that still conceives itself as a kind of a colonial resource colony, like on a very fundamental level, that we dig stuff up, we do a certain amount of processing, we sell it for whatever the global currency is and buy stuff back. We don't have a notion of keep raising ourselves to higher and higher levels of development. Like South Korea started with absolutely nothing after the Korean War, but by investing in the resources they had, their people, they steadily built themselves up to higher and higher levels where they have a GDP per capita equal to us and a much higher technology base, right? The U.S. since World War II has had a very effective research and development established, both for military and for all sorts of other technology. And it can be very fairly said that most of the technologies that China is working with right now came out of the U.S. R&D establishment. The Americans just didn't create enough demand for them so that they ended up being adopted and evolved in the United States.
And I think it's also fair to say that in the American context, one of the reasons it didn't develop demand is the influence of incumbents. I mean, if you already
Yeah,
had,
and the availability of cheap fossil fuels.
yes, exactly right. And now you can see that Canada is suffering from a version of that. We have our own incumbents, oil and gas companies, utilities, mining companies, banks, and so on, that are acting as a brake because they all are jumping on this renewed demand or renewed enthusiasm, hysteria almost for oil and gas production and exports, and completely ignoring, they're doing a version of what the Americans did, which is ignoring the arc of the electrostate.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Like once you start to view us as kind of a very wealthy resource colony, right? And the Australians do a certain amount of this too. Is like all the savings we have, all the wealth we have tends to follow channel into five big banks, and a few big investment firms. And they don't tend to invest in startups and low, high potential companies here in Canada. They tend to take most of their money and put it back into the natural resources sector one way or the other, or real estate, right? Which is why we don't have the whole ecosystem here in Canada.
Yeah, indeed. Well, look, Chris, this has been a fascinating conversation, and we're going to be doing more of this with you because we agree with you that Canada needs a new direction, new strategy, new conversation, and if it has to start someplace, so maybe it just starts here. Thank you very much for this.
Thanks for having me, Markham.